She heard everything through the wall, the screaming, the thuds, the silence, and she did nothing. Her neighbor, a gentle nurse named Sophia, was 8 months pregnant, alone, and being destroyed by the man she had given everything to, a man who had taken her savings, her dignity, and now believed he could take her child. But what Ryan never counted on was who Sophia's brothers were. 3 men, 3 phone calls, 3 private jets in the dark, and a woman who had stayed silent far too long, finally deciding that one more second of silence would make her a criminal. What you are about to hear is a story of betrayal so calculated, so cold-blooded, that it will make your hands shake, but it is also a story of something else entirely, the kind of loyalty that moves mountains, and the kind of courage that only reveals itself when everything has already been taken. Stay with she, because the moment those 3 brothers walked through that hospital door, nothing would ever be the same again. Then came the other woman. I'd see her expensive car parked out front, a sleek black thing that didn't belong on our quiet suburban street. Vanessa, I learned her name was later. She had a way of walking, a confidence that felt like a threat. I'd watch from my kitchen window as she'd whisper in Ryan's ear, her crimson lips moving like she was casting a spell. I knew poison when I saw it. The night it all shattered started with the smell of roasting chicken from Sophia's kitchen, a hopeful scent that drifted over the fence. I imagined her inside, waiting, maybe humming to the little life inside her. I knew she'd been to the hospital for a scan. She'd told me that morning, her eyes shining with tears of joy. But when Ryan's truck screeched into the driveway, followed by the slam of the front door, the hopeful aroma was choked out by a wave of pure dread. His words were muffled through the wall, but the accusation was clear. Whose child is it? Destushinat. I froze, dish towel in my hand, my own heart a block of ice in my chest. I should have done something. I should have gone over there, but I didn't. The lie had taken root, and I was listening to it grow into a monster next door. I heard her pleading, her voice so small and fragile, a thread of sound against his roaring rage. It's yours, Ryan. Our baby. The words were followed by a sickening thud against the shared wall of our living rooms. My breath caught in my throat. I pictured Sophia, her hands instinctively flying to her belly. I heard a muffled cry, a sound of such profound pain that it vibrated through the floorboards. Please, Ryan, don't. Her voice trembled through the plaster, a desperate prayer I was now a party to. Then came another thud, harder this time. I sank into my armchair, my own body trembling, a coward in my own home. I was close enough to hear her fall, to hear her gasp for air between sobs. Each strike he delivered felt like a blow against my own conscience. I sat there, paralyzed by fear, my silence making me an accomplice. To him, in his drunken fury, her pleas were just more lies. I could hear the sheer violence in his movements, the furniture scraping against the floor, the sound of his heavy breathing. I imagined Sophia on the floor, doing the only thing a mother could do, shielding her child with her own body, absorbing every ounce of his blind rage. Her survival was for that baby. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. Her whispered pleas for her little one to stay strong were barely audible, but I heard them. They were the ghost of a sound that will haunt me forever. Then, the most terrifying sound of all, silence, a heavy final quiet that felt more violent than the blows themselves. I could hear his voice, one last time, a low, venomous hiss that dripped with a terrifying finality. You'll regret lying to me. I pictured her there, broken and alone, and knew my inaction was a stain on my soul. My house was dark, but my mind was screaming. For minutes, that felt like an eternity, I sat there listening to the silence from next door. The cries had stopped. The thuds were over, and in their place was a void so terrifying I couldn't breathe. Was she okay? Was the baby okay? The questions pounded in my head, fueled by a shame so deep it burned. Then, a small light flickered inside me. Not courage, but a desperate need to undo my cowardice. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold the phone. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 9, then 1, then 1 again. My voice was a choked whisper when the dispatcher answered. That single phone call was the heaviest thing I've ever lifted. I knew that Ryan and his venomous woman had no idea that my quiet, trembling voice would bring a reckoning right to their doorstep. I knew Sophia, you see, not just as a neighbor. At 28 years old, she was the kindest nurse at Los Angeles General, the one who held my husband's hand in his final days. I knew her goodness firsthand. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who brought over a plate of cookies just because. She exuded a compassion that was as natural as breathing, a light that everyone saw, except for the man she gave her heart to. I remember when she married Ryan 5 years ago. He was just a mechanic then, grease under his nails, but a universe of promises in his eyes. Sophia saw a king in him. She believed in his dreams so fiercely that she worked herself to the bone, picking up extra shifts, her own dreams put on hold for his. My friends and I would cluck our tongues and say she gave too much, but she'd just smile that radiant smile and say, "That's what love is." For years, I watched her pour every ounce of herself into that marriage, a tireless builder of a home that was slowly becoming a prison. And it all started to crumble when that black car started showing up, when Vanessa Lopez slithered into their lives. At first, I only saw the subtle signs, the ones you try to ignore. Ryan coming home later and later, the smell of cheap perfume clinging to his clothes. The way Sophia's shoulders began to slump, her brilliant smile becoming a little more brittle each day. I'd see her sitting by her window at night, a solitary silhouette, her hands resting on her growing belly, waiting for a man who no longer deserved her. When he did come home, I'd hear the bitterness in his voice, the cruel jabs about her job, her cooking, her very presence. Through it all, she endured. I'd see her in her garden the next morning, talking to her belly, whispering promises I couldn't hear but could feel in my heart. Mommy will protect you. Mommy will never give up. It was a mantra of survival, a quiet war she was fighting all on her own, and I was the neighbor who heard her cries and did nothing but close the blinds. Her strength was a quiet, stubborn thing. She once mentioned her family, 3 older brothers who lived far away, scattered across the country in places like New York and San Francisco. She spoke of them with such love. Ethan, the powerful one. Matthew, the brilliant one. Lucas, the bold one. They sounded like giants, men who could move mountains. I always wondered why she never called them. Why did she feel so alone that she couldn't reach out to the titans she described? From my side of the fence, her world seemed to have shrunk to just that little house and the monster who lived in it. I suppose I understood. There's a particular kind of shame that grows in the dark, the kind that makes you believe the bruises are your own fault, the kind that convinces you that if you just stay silent, if you just try a little harder, the man you fell in love with will come back. She never told anyone about the escalating cruelty, about the nights he'd lock her out, or the way his eyes had turned cold and empty. She hid the bruises under the long sleeves of her nursing scrubs, perfecting a smile for her patients and neighbors that was a masterpiece of deception. Her colleagues at the hospital probably saw her as a pillar of strength, a rock. They had no idea she was crumbling from the inside out, turning to dust behind that brave face. And I knew. I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes when his truck pulled up. I saw the way she'd flinch if he raised his voice. I knew, and I stayed silent, a spectator to her slow-motion destruction. That night, As she lay unconscious on her living room floor, my shaky phone call shattered that silence. With the press of 3 buttons, I finally broke my own vow of cowardice and invited the flashing red and blue lights to her doorstep. The wail of the sirens tore through the suburban quiet. From behind my curtains, I watched the street come alive with the kind of urgent, flashing lights that meant a life was hanging by a thread. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, became silhouettes in their own windows, their whispers carrying on the night air. I saw the paramedics rush into that small, sad house. A few minutes later, they emerged, carrying Sophia on a stretcher. She looked so small, so pale, her arms still wrapped protectively around her stomach. Through the open doorway, I caught a glimpse of the wooden stick he had used, propped in the corner like a forgotten piece of trash. It was a silent testament to the horror I had only heard. In the back of the ambulance, I could just make out the shape of an oxygen mask being placed over her face. My heart seized with fear for her and for the innocent child she had fought so hard to protect. I watched as they checked for the baby's heartbeat, their movements swift and professional. One of them shouted something about Los Angeles General, and the urgency in his voice sent a fresh wave of terror through me. 2 lives, not just one. The ambulance sped away, its sirens a mournful cry fading into the distance. Inside my own quiet house, I could only pray. I prayed she would hold on, that her whispered promise to her little one would be enough. Back at the house next door, Ryan didn't follow the ambulance. He just stood there in the doorway, a figure of pure, unrepentant rage. My fear turned to ice in my veins. Then, like an apparition, Vanessa Lopez emerged from the darkness of the side yard. She slid up to him, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm, her voice a poisonous whisper that I couldn't hear, but could easily imagine. "You did the right thing," she was probably saying. She deserved it. Her words would be the chains that bound him to her, pulling him further into the darkness they had created together. Meanwhile, I knew Los Angeles General would be a hive of activity. I pictured the emergency room, a place where Sophia had been the caregiver, now receiving her as a patient. It was a cruel, twisted irony. The nurses on duty would know her instantly. I could imagine their shocked whispers echoing through the ward. "It's Sophia, one of our own." The thought brought tears to my eyes. Hours would crawl by under those sterile, fluorescent lights as doctors fought to save her and her unborn child. The night would be long, thick with worry, and the unspoken question of whether they would both survive. While the hospital staff worked, and while I kept my vigil, from my window, a different kind of storm was gathering miles away, a storm that my single phone call had summoned. I couldn't have known it then, but that call did more than bring an ambulance. Across the country, phones were ringing in the high-powered offices of 3 formidable men. In a skyscraper overlooking New York City, Ethan Bennett would have cut a meeting short. In San Francisco, Matthew Bennett would have pushed aside financial reports. And in a brightly lit office in Silicon Valley, Lucas Bennett would have stopped coding. They would each answer, and each would hear the same devastating words. "Your sister Sophia, she's in the hospital. She was attacked." In that instant, business empires would halt. Private jets would be scrambled. 3 brothers, united by a single, protective fury, would drop everything. As the sun began to rise over our quiet California suburb, they would be converging on Los Angeles, bringing with them a wrath that Ryan and Vanessa could never have anticipated. And their impending arrival would tear down the flimsy world of lies that Ryan and Vanessa thought they had built so carefully. I remember Ryan when he was just a young mechanic with big dreams and calloused hands that knew how to fix things, not break them. Sophia had seen a hero in him, pouring her life's savings and her endless energy into his dream of an auto shop. She truly believed that love was about sacrifice, and she gave him every last piece of herself. For a while, it seemed like her faith was well placed. He worked hard, grateful for the incredible woman standing beside him. But his dream soured. The shop faltered, the bills mounted, and the gratitude in his eyes was slowly replaced by resentment. My phone call had been a small, trembling act, but it had set in motion an avalanche of justice, and I finally felt a flicker of hope that the light would find its way back into the house next door. I remember the first time I felt that cold knot of dread in my stomach for Sophia. It wasn't when she came into the ER bruised and broken. It was months before, on a quiet Tuesday shift. She was stalking the supply closet, her movements jerky, her usual bright energy dimmed to a low flicker. She told me Ryan's restaurant was struggling, how the newer, shinier spots downtown were bleeding him dry. "He's just so proud," she whispered, her voice tight, "and he feels like he's failing." I saw how his insecurity was already a poison seeping into their lives, how he was starting to resent her success, her steady nurse's salary that paid the bills his dream no longer could. It was around then that the whispers started, carried on the city breeze like smoke. Whispers about a woman named Vanessa Lopez, the manager of a bar where shadows and bad decisions danced together. I never met her, but I imagined her perfectly. The kind of woman who could spot a man's weakness from across a crowded room and know exactly how to turn it into a weapon. Ryan, drowning in his own bitterness, wouldn't have stood a chance. He would have looked like a prayer she knew how to answer. We all knew something was wrong. Sophia started taking extra shifts, her excuses for Ryan's absence becoming thinner and thinner. I could see the shame in her eyes when she'd say he was working late. Knowing we all heard the rumors, the talk was that this Vanessa woman was weaving a fantasy for him, a world where he was a misunderstood king instead of a man failing at his own life. I can almost hear her voice now, slick and sweet like poisoned honey, telling him he was destined for greatness, that Sophia, with her sensible scrubs and the gentle swell of their coming child, was an anchor holding him down. She wasn't just building him up. She was tearing Sophia down in his mind, convincing him that the woman who loved him was an obstacle. And the worst part, the part that still makes my stomach turn, was the lie she planted about the baby. A lie so vile, so cruel, that only a man desperate to justify his own betrayal would ever believe it. But he did. He swallowed it whole because it gave him the permission he needed to hate her. I watched from the sidelines as that poison did its work. I saw the vibrant, joyful Sophia I knew fade away, replaced by a quiet, haunted version of herself. The dark circles under her eyes told a story she wouldn't speak aloud. I wanted to ask, to grab her by the shoulders and tell her to run, but I didn't. I was a coward, afraid of overstepping, of making things worse. My silence feels like a crime now. I know now that behind their closed doors, Vanessa was methodically dismantling the man Sophia loved, twisting his every failure into a fault of his wife's. She fed his ego while starving his conscience, whispering tales of late-night meetings that were more than professional. She turned his love into a weapon pointed right at Sophia's heart. And Ryan? He let her. He let her transform him from a husband into a monster, all because he couldn't stand the sight of his own reflection. Vanessa wasn't in love. She was an architect of ruin, seeing Ryan as nothing more than a stepping stone to the life she felt she deserved. The night the ambulance brought Sophia in, I was on duty. I'll never forget the sight of her on that gurney, or the hollow look in Ryan's eyes as he stood in the waiting room later. He was trembling, lost in a fog of his own making, and then I saw her, Vanessa, standing just behind him, a chillingly triumphant smile playing on her lips. I overheard her words, meant only for him, but sharp enough to cut through the sterile air of the hospital. "Don't worry, baby," she murmured, her voice dripping with possessiveness. "Once she's out of the picture, everything you own will be ours. We'll finally be free." A shiver went down my spine. Ryan just nodded, a puppet on her strings. But I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a terrifying realization of the abyss he'd just thrown himself into. They thought they had won. They thought their cruelty was a private, secret thing. But I knew, watching them, that they had just lit a fuse. The sound of the explosion was coming, and it would be deafening. The next morning, the hospital was buzzing with hushed, horrified conversations. Everyone loved Sophia. Seeing her name on the patient roster felt like a physical blow to our whole unit. I was one of the first to check on her after my shift. She was lying there, so small in that big hospital bed, the vibrant color of the bruises on her face, a stark contrast to her pale skin. She tried to smile when she saw me, a broken, painful gesture. "I'm okay, Angela," she insisted, her voice a fragile whisper. But her eyes, swollen and full of a terror she couldn't hide, told the real story. She was terrified he would come back to finish what he started. We brought her flowers and magazines, offering clumsy words of comfort that felt completely useless. All I wanted to do was hold her and tell her she wasn't alone, but I felt paralyzed by my own guilt for not seeing this coming, for not doing something sooner. What happened next was a masterclass in cruelty. While Sophia was trying to piece her shattered world back together, in that quiet hospital room, Ryan and Vanessa were putting on a show for the entire city. My friend, another nurse, saw them at that popular diner downtown, bold as anything. She sent me a picture. Vanessa's hand was draped over his, her head thrown back in laughter, not a care in the world. It was a slap in the face to Sophia, to all of us who cared about her. The community we lived in wasn't that big. People knew Ryan was married, and they adored Sophia. But Vanessa's lies were contagious. Soon, the whispers shifted from concern for Sophia to suspicion. Maybe she drove him to it, some would say, repeating the filth Vanessa had spread. There are two sides to every story. I felt a rage building inside me, a helplessness that was becoming unbearable. Each rumor felt like another blow against Sophia, who was too weak to even defend herself. The ultimate act of humiliation happened right here, in our sanctuary. I was at the main nurse's station charting when they walked in. I couldn't believe my eyes. Vanessa was clinging to Ryan's arm, poured into a red dress, so loud it screamed for attention. They walked with a purpose, a deliberate, slow pace designed to make sure everyone saw them. Their smiles were weapons, sharp and aimed directly at the heart of our unit. Then Vanessa's voice, artificially loud and clear, cut through the quiet hum of the floor. "You don't need to worry about liars anymore," she said to Ryan, looking around to make sure she had an audience. "You have me now." It was a declaration of war, performed on the one patch of ground where Sophia should have felt safe. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with the shock and pity of every nurse and patient who witnessed it. And there was Sophia, just around the corner, sitting in a wheelchair by the window. I saw the exact moment she heard them. Her body went rigid, her face draining of all color. Our eyes met across the floor, and in her gaze I saw a spirit cracking under an impossible weight. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was public execution. For him to bring that woman here, to our workplace, in front of the people she considered her second family. It was a level of cruelty I couldn't comprehend. Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, hot and angry, but she refused to let them fall. With a dignity that broke my heart, She slowly turned her wheelchair and began to push herself back toward the lonely quiet of her room. Behind her, Vanessa's laughter echoed down the hall, a sound so vile it will haunt me forever. And Ryan, he didn't even have the decency to look at her. He just stood there, a hollow man who had sold his soul. I gave her an hour before I went to check on her. The room was dark, but I could hear the sound of her trying to cry without making a noise. She was curled on her side, one hand protectively clutching her belly, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. I heard her whisper to her unborn child, her voice cracking with grief. "I'm so sorry," she wept. "I'm so sorry you have to start your life with this darkness, but I promise you, I swear to you, I won't let them win." In that moment, her pain was so immense, so absolute, it felt like a living thing in the room with us. She had no idea that her quiet promise was an echo of a storm gathering thousands of miles away. She didn't know that 3 men, her brothers, were already packing bags, canceling meetings, and boarding planes. The Bennetts were coming to Los Angeles, and when they landed, Ryan and Vanessa would learn the true meaning of the word war. Those first few nights were the worst. For everyone else on our floor, the hospital was a place to mend. For Sophia, it was a cage built from his betrayal. I'd find her awake in the middle of the night, just staring at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, her eyes wide and haunted. I knew she was replaying it all, every lie, every accusation. I could almost hear his voice in the silence of her room, twisting the truth until it became unrecognizable. She told me once, in a moment of raw honesty, about the sound the wooden stick made, about the sting of it against her skin, and how the worst part was the finality of his footsteps walking away while she lay there, bleeding and begging him to stay. The man she had built her life around hadn't just left her, he had tried to erase her. During the day, she'd put on a brave face for us, her friends, her colleagues. But it was just a fragile mask. She'd offer a weak, tired smile when I brought her food, and she would nod politely when we'd whisper our support. But I knew it was all a performance. The second her door clicked shut, the mask would crumble, and the raw, silent weeping would begin again. Her biggest fear, the one that kept her awake at night, wasn't for her own safety. It was for the tiny, fragile life she was carrying. Every so often, her hand would fly to her stomach, her breath catching. I'd see a flicker of life in her eyes, a reason to keep fighting. "Please stay with me," I heard her whisper to her belly one night. "You're all I have." But the doubt was a poison, too. How could she do this alone? How could she protect this child from a father who had become a monster, a man who now saw them as enemies? The shame was eating her alive from the inside out. I knew she was thinking about her brothers. She talked about them sometimes, Ethan, Matthew, and Lucas. The way she spoke their names was with a mixture of fierce love and deep intimidation. They were titans, powerful men who moved in worlds she couldn't imagine. Her pride, a quality I usually admired, was now her worst enemy. She was terrified of them seeing her like this, broken and defeated. To her, admitting the truth felt like admitting failure on a catastrophic scale. That evening, I couldn't stand it anymore. I pulled a chair up to her bedside. "Sophia," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You can't do this by yourself. You have a family. Call them." She just shook her head. The tears she was always holding back finally spilling over. "They're too busy, Angela. They're important. They have their own lives to live. I can't be their burden." I took her hand. It was so cold. "A burden?" I said, my voice firm. "Honey, you're their sister. You're their blood. If they had any idea what that man did to you, they would tear down mountains to get to you." But she just turned her face to the wall, pulling away from me, her heart sealed shut with a sorrow so deep I couldn't reach it. Later that night, when the floor was quiet and the city outside was asleep, I heard her break again. The sounds were so quiet, so full of despair. "I can't fight them," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm not strong enough. Maybe Ryan was right all along. Maybe I really am nothing." Her words were a physical blow. The weight of her loneliness was crushing her, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of surrender in her. The thought was terrifying. Her spirit, once so bright and resilient, was unraveling thread by thread. And then, in the deepest part of the night, her phone, sitting on the bedside table, lit up with a soft buzz. She reached for it mechanically, her movements slow and heavy. I saw the screen from the doorway. The name made my own heart stop dead in my chest. Ethan Bennett. Her hand trembled as she answered. The call didn't last more than 2 minutes, but it changed everything. I heard her trying so hard to sound okay, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I'm fine, Ethan. Please don't worry." But the broken sobs that followed told him the truth she was trying to hide. I didn't hear his side of the conversation, but I could feel the shift in the air, the sudden charge of electricity. I knew in that moment that Ryan and Vanessa's comfortable little world of lies was about to be obliterated. I found out later what happened in the hours that followed. Ethan, the oldest, the real estate mogul, walked out of his New York City boardroom without a backward glance. His assistant scrambled after him, talking about billion-dollar deals, but he just cut her off. "Cancel it all," he commanded, his voice like ice. "My sister needs me." He was on a private jet before sunrise, his face a mask of cold fury. Miles away, in San Francisco, Matthew Bennett, the strategic genius, stood up in the middle of a high-stakes meeting with investors, his laptop snapping shut. "Family emergency," was all he said, but the look on his face silenced the entire room. They had never seen him lose his legendary calm. They had never seen the storm hiding behind his eyes. And in Silicon Valley, Lucas, the tech prodigy, pushed away from his desk, leaving lines of brilliant code unfinished. For the Bennett brothers, there was only one priority: family, and someone had hurt theirs. It all started with a phone call, didn't it? Not for them, but for me. My own phone had rung that morning, my daughter checking in, and the sound of it sent a jolt of memory through me, sharp and unwelcome. I remembered the first time I heard a phone shatter against a wall next door. I remember seeing Sophia in her garden the next day, her smile a little too bright, a new, ugly bruise blooming on her arm like a poisonous flower. I'd said nothing. Now, looking through my kitchen window, I saw 3 sleek black cars pull up to her house, silent and menacing as sharks. 3 men got out. They didn't look like they belonged on our quiet suburban street. They moved with a purpose that made my old heart hammer against my ribs. Their shoulders were broad, their suits perfect, and their faces were masks of cold fury. I knew, even before I recognized the oldest one from a magazine cover, that these were her brothers, and I knew they were here because the silence had finally been broken. They weren't just powerful businessmen today. They were a storm that had finally come to reclaim one of its own. I watched them go inside, the door closing with a definitive click that echoed in the sudden quiet. I'd seen the ambulance take Sophia away late last night, its red and blue lights painting my bedroom walls in frantic, terrifying strokes. I had stood right here, clutching my robe, my hand frozen halfway to my own phone, too scared, too old, too convinced it wasn't my place. When her brothers walked into that hospital, I imagined the scene. I pictured Sophia, so small in that sterile bed, looking out the window, the way she always looked out of hers at home, like she was searching for an escape. The first brother, the one they called Ethan, would fill the doorway, his sheer size a promise of protection she hadn't had in years. I could almost feel his rage at the sight of her marked skin, a fury I myself had swallowed down every time I saw a new sign of his cruelty. The second brother, the thoughtful one, would touch her arm gently, a gesture of comfort I should have offered over the fence 100 times. His quiet pain would mirror the ache in my own chest, the regret of a neighbor who chose to water her roses instead of asking the right questions. And the youngest, all fire and tears, would drop to his knees beside her, his raw emotion a testament to a love her husband had clearly never understood. I could hear her whisper, "I didn't want to bother you," because that's what he had trained her to believe, that she was a bother, an inconvenience. But then I heard Ethan's voice, not with my ears, but with my soul, a roar of conviction. "You are our life." They would form a wall around her, a fortress of family. It was everything I had prayed for, and the relief was so sharp it felt like a wound. Because Ryan was still out there, and that woman, Vanessa, was still whispering her venom. And this was only the beginning of a war I had watched fester for far too long. The battle lines were being drawn, and I was a coward hiding behind my curtains. After the brothers left for the hospital, a heavy stillness fell over Sophia's house. It was the kind of quiet that feels louder than noise. I watched them return hours later, their movements still rigid with anger. Ethan, the leader, stalked back and forth on the porch, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, controlled rumble that promised retribution. Matthew, the strategist, sat on the top step, a legal pad balanced on his knee, his pen flying across the page as if he were mapping out an invasion. And Lucas, the heart of their fury, stayed closest to the door, a loyal guard dog who refused to leave his post, his knuckles white as he clenched and unclenched his fists. My own hands trembled as I remembered seeing Sophia in the grocery store last week. She'd flinched when a stockboy dropped a box too loudly. I'd pretended not to notice. I imagined Ethan's voice inside that house, demanding the whole story, forcing her to speak the ugly truth she had tried so hard to conceal. I knew the shame that would burn in her throat. I'd seen it in her eyes every time she avoided my gaze. He had convinced her this was her fault, but looking at her brothers, I knew she'd find the courage to finally let the poison out. She would tell them about his drinking, about the nights he came home smelling of cheap perfume and stale smoke from Vanessa's bar. She'd tell them about the shouting matches I'd heard through my walls, the vicious words, the sound of things breaking. She would have to describe the moment he raised a hand to her, the way he'd used a piece of wood, a detail so monstrous it made me feel sick to my stomach. Each confession would be another layer of skin peeled back, but with them there, she wouldn't bleed out alone. They were her transfusion, her strength. When the story was finally told, I could picture the explosion. Lucas, raw with a righteous rage that I, in my cowardice, had suppressed. "I'll kill him," he'd snarl, and a part of me would have cheered him on. But Ethan, the general, would rein him in, his own fury a cold, sharp weapon. We act with precision. And Matthew, the architect of their revenge, would already be 10 steps ahead. Ryan isn't the only problem. Vanessa is dangerous too. He was right. I'd seen her car there at all hours, seen her laughing with Ryan on the porch while Sophia was inside. They were a team, a pair of predators. I imagined Sophia's whispered fear, her voice trembling as she recounted his threats of divorce, of leaving her with nothing. He wanted to strip her bare of her dignity, her home, her child. The thought was a physical blow, a confirmation of the evil I had only glimpsed. Then I pictured Ethan's promise, a vow spoken into the charged air of that room. "He won't take anything. He thinks you're alone, Sophie. He has no idea who your family is." That was the truth Ryan had forgotten. the power he had so foolishly underestimated. Lucas would grip her hand, his touch a promise of vengeance. Matthew would lay out the plan like a master tactician. Gather the evidence, find the witnesses, expose the lies. They would dismantle Ryan's carefully constructed world, brick by brick, until his public image was nothing but rubble. They would destroy his power by revealing the monster he was. And watching them through my window, these three avenging angels, I knew they would succeed. I prayed they would. I saw Sophia's face in my mind, her tears finally flowing, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of being saved. Hope, a feeling I hadn't let myself have for her in months, began to flicker inside me. Fragile but persistent. I imagined Ethan's hand on her shoulder, his voice a bedrock of certainty. Rest now, Sophie. Let us carry this fight. She deserved to rest. She had carried this burden alone for too long. But as I watched the lights in her house stay on late into the night, I saw the brothers' shadows moving behind the curtains. They were warriors preparing for battle, and I knew this was far from over. Ryan and that woman wouldn't just disappear. They would fight back. Dirty and cruel. The Bennett brothers had made their move, and the coming retaliation would surely shake our quiet little street to its very foundations. I was watering my petunias, my hands shaking so badly I was probably drowning them, when Ryan's sports car screeched to a stop in front of the house. He wasn't alone. That woman, Vanessa, uncoiled herself from the passenger seat, her smile as sharp and predatory as a shard of glass. He slung his arm around her, a disgusting display of ownership, and smirked at the home he had desecrated. He believed he was invincible. My heart pounded with a nauseating mix of fear and rage. They were heading for the hospital. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. Inside, the brothers were likely planning their strategy, unaware the enemy was already on the move. I imagined a nurse, her face pale, announcing the arrival of Sophia's husband. That word, husband, was a lie, a perversion of what he had been. He was her tormentor. That word must have felt like a razor blade to Sophia. I could picture her shaking her head, her voice a weak whisper, begging not to see him. But a man like Ryan doesn't wait for permission. He would have shoved his way into that room, Vanessa slithering behind him, their combined presence sucking the very air from the space. I saw Ethan, a mountain of a man, stepping between them, his body a shield. "You have no right to be here," he'd growl, the sound rumbling with a threat Ryan was too arrogant to understand. Ryan's sneer would be his only answer, his words laced with poison. "She's still my wife." Then he'd turn that cold, dead-eyed gaze on Sophia, twisting the knife. "Don't act like you're the victim here, Sophia. Everyone knows the truth. That baby isn't mine." The cruelty of it stole my breath, even from half a town away. The pain that would slash across her face was a pain I felt deep in my bones. "How can you say that?" she would cry, her last shred of hope crumbling, and Vanessa would be right there, her voice a syrupy poison. Poor Ryan. Imagine being tricked. It was a performance, and they were playing to an audience of one. Sophia herself. They wanted to break her. I imagined the youngest brother, Lucas, finally snapping, his rage boiling over as he lunged for Ryan. But Matthew, the calm center of the storm, would hold him back. "Not here, not yet." Ryan, mistaking tactical restraint for fear, would see his opening. He'd toss the divorce papers onto her bed like a declaration of war. "Sign it. You'll get nothing." He would list his spoils, the house, the money, the car, and then the most barbaric threat of all, custody. He would take her child just to complete her destruction. I could see Sophia's hand flying to her stomach, a mother's instinct to protect her unborn child from the monster in the room. The terror would be suffocating, an icy wave dragging her under. You wouldn't take my baby. And his smile, I could picture it perfectly. A flash of white teeth and a predatory grin. Watch me. For a beat, the world would stop. The weight of his evil would hang in the air, thick and suffocating. Then Ethan, his voice dropping to a lethally quiet register, would speak. You've made the biggest mistake of your life. Ryan would laugh. A hollow, uncertain sound. You think you can scare me? Oh, you fool, I thought, staring at my drowned flowers. You have no idea. Ethan would lean in, the fire of a dynasty's wrath in his eyes. She belongs to no one, and if you try to take her child, you'll face consequences you can't even imagine. Vanessa, smarter than him, would sense the shift in power, the gathering storm. She'd pull him away, whispering promises that they were untouchable. As they left, Ryan would throw one last hateful look at Sophia. Sign the papers, or I'll make sure you regret it. He was a fool. He had no clue that his threats were nothing more than fuel for the fire the Bennetts were building, a fire that was about to consume him whole. The tension in that hospital room must have been a physical thing long after they'd gone. The divorce papers on the nightstand radiating pure malice. But Sophia wasn't alone anymore. She was surrounded. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept watching her house, where the lights burned bright, a war room in the heart of our sleepy neighborhood. I saw the brothers through the window, gathered in the living room, their faces grim. The storm was here. Ethan, the immovable object, stood with his arms crossed, a portrait of controlled rage. Matthew, the unstoppable force, sat hunched over his notes, his mind already weaving a legal web from which Ryan could never escape. And Lucas paced like a caged tiger, the kinetic energy of his anger practically vibrating through the walls. I heard Ethan's voice in my head, a low, determined vow. Ryan thinks he can destroy her life with a piece of paper. He doesn't know who he's dealing with. Matthew would agree, his focus absolute. We need a case that crushes him completely. He would be the one to remember Vanessa, the snake in the garden. We'll dig until there's nothing left of their lies. Then Lucas, unable to contain his fury, would slam his fist against the wall, the sound I had so often heard from next door, but this time it was in Sophia's defense. He hit her, Matt. He could have killed her and the baby. He'd want immediate, physical retribution. It was then, standing in my dark kitchen, that I made a decision. My silence had made me complicit. It was time to act. My hands trembled as I walked to the small desk where I kept my laptop. My front door security camera. It records everything on a loop. I remembered the night he'd struck her, the night of the stick. He'd dragged her out of the car, shouting. The camera would have caught it. My heart pounding, I found the footage. There it was, grainy but undeniable. With shaking fingers, I found the corporate website for Bennett Enterprises. I found a general contact email. I attached the video file. My small, cowardly, courageous act. My message was short. For Sophia. From a neighbor who should have done more. I still remember the first day she was brought in, a ghost in a hospital gown. I saw her brothers in the hallway, their faces carved from stone and fury. I heard the youngest one, Lucas, his voice thick with rage, demanding to know why they couldn't just find that man and make him pay. It was the oldest, Ethan, who reined him in. His voice was a low, dangerous thing, cutting through the sterile silence of the ward. Because a scene is what he's banking on, he said, his eyes like chips of ice. He wants a public spectacle, something he can twist. We're not giving him that satisfaction. We're not going to fight him. We're going to dismantle him. Systematically. We will strip him of his money, his reputation, his power until he has nothing left but the consequences of his actions. I watched Lucas, his shoulders heaving with a pain so raw, It was hard to look at, finally give a sharp, reluctant nod. Okay, he conceded. But I swear, if he even breathes in her direction again, all bets are off. Then Matthew, the quiet one, spoke up, his mind already miles down the road. I'm on it. I'll bring in the best private investigators. We'll dig into every transaction, every late payment, every rotten business deal his mistress is involved in. Men like Ryan, they're arrogant. They think they're invisible. They always leave a trail of breadcrumbs leading right back to their own filth. Ethan's jaw was set, a muscle ticking violently. He was right. We just had to follow the smoke. And the moment we have undeniable proof, Ethan continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, we go straight to the press. We make it public. He knew his enemy. Ryan's entire world is built on a facade. He lives and dies by his public image, the devoted husband, the upstanding community man. When we shatter that illusion, when we show everyone he's a violent cheat being led by the nose, his good name will turn to ash. His credibility in any court proceeding will be non-existent. The three of them stood there, bound by a singular, cold resolve that sent a shiver down my spine. This was no longer just about shielding Sophia from a monster. This was about justice. It was about ensuring that Ryan and that woman, Vanessa, could never inflict this kind of pain on anyone ever again. I saw Lucas let out a long, shaky breath, the fire in his eyes banking into a steady, determined glow. We'll finish this, he murmured, his voice cracking with emotion. For her. For the baby. As I turned to leave them to their grim planning, I saw Ethan place a heavy, reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder, a silent promise that they would not fail. And with that, the decision was made. A silent war was declared, the strategies laid out, the trap meticulously prepared for a man who had no idea what was coming. But as the Bennett brothers mobilized their forces, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were underestimating the viper in their midst. Vanessa was weaving her own venomous plot, one aimed at Sophia's most vulnerable point. For what felt like an eternity, Sophia drifted in her hospital bed, her physical wounds mending far faster than the ones I couldn't see. Her brothers were a constant, silent presence, a human wall keeping Ryan and Vanessa at bay. Ethan was a whirlwind of hushed, urgent calls with lawyers. Matthew barely looked up from his laptop, his fingers flying as he chased digital ghosts through financial records. And Lucas, he never left. He sat by her bed, a loyal sentinel. They were building an ironclad cage for Ryan, brick by painstaking brick. But Ryan Miller wasn't the type to wait for judgment. I saw it in the smug way he'd strutted in before security removed him, and I knew Vanessa, his puppeteer, was feeding him poison. I could almost hear her voice, a venomous whisper in his ear as they plotted in the dark somewhere. Fighting them head-on is a fool's game, Ryan. They have money, power. You'll be crushed. But if you play the part of the broken, repentant husband, if you make her believe you've changed, she'll lower her defenses. That's our opening. I knew men like Ryan. The thought of admitting fault, of appearing weak, would have choked him. But I also knew the cunning of a woman like Vanessa would win out. Sophia's compassion was her biggest vulnerability, her capacity for forgiveness, her desperate need to believe in the good of the man she had loved. That was the weapon they would turn against her. And just as I feared, Ryan became a performer worthy of an award. He appeared at the nurse's station one afternoon, looking like a different man. His clothes were clean, his hair was combed, and his entire demeanor was one of profound sorrow. He held a bouquet of white lilies, a symbol of purity that felt like a slap in the face. I was at the desk, and I scowled at him. "You're not supposed to be here," I told him flatly. "I just need to apologize," he pleaded, his voice soft, his gaze fixed on the floor like a chastised schoolboy. Please, just 5 minutes. When he slipped into Sophia's room, I saw Lucas jump from his chair, ready to tear him apart, but Sophia stopped him with a weak, trembling hand. Wait, she whispered, and I saw the conflict warring in her eyes. I'd never seen a man fake humility so well. The flowers trembled in his hand as he neared her bed, a perfect touch of manufactured nervousness. Sophie, he breathed, using a nickname that was clearly meant to wound her with nostalgia. I am so sorry. I was a different person. Vanessa manipulated me, twisted my thinking. I wasn't myself. Please find it in your heart to forgive me. Shh, just let me come home, he begged. I watched as tears, real or not, filled Sophia's eyes. Her heart was in a tug of war with her mind. I could see the memories of the violence flickering behind her gaze, warring with the ghost of the man she thought she had married. Was it possible? Could he have changed? Could her baby have a father after all? Lucas broke the spell, his voice a low snarl. You really think we're going to fall for this pathetic act? Get out now before I save security the trouble. But Ryan's performance was masterful. He never broke eye contact with Sophia, his voice cracking with emotion. I'll get help. I'll go to therapy. I'll stop drinking. I'll do anything you ask. I just want my family. Please, Sophie. Her lower lip trembled, the room thick with her indecision. I could feel her brother's silent screams from across the room, begging her not to listen. But her heart, so bruised and so big, was desperate for a glimmer of hope. Ryan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. That was his cue. Ryan sank to his knees by her bed, a gesture of complete submission, and the tears he'd been holding back now streamed down his face. They were perfectly timed, perfectly executed. He pushed the bouquet into her hands. Then let me earn it back, he choked out. Just give me one chance. That's all I'm asking for. From the corner, I saw Ethan and Matthew exchange a look of pure, cold fury. They weren't buying a second of it. But I saw Sophia's fingers tighten around the stems of those lilies, her chest rising and falling with a silent, agonizing battle. As she sat there, contemplating his plea, she had no idea that nestled between the innocent-looking petals was the first move in a game designed to destroy her completely. The lilies sat on her nightstand, their scent filling the sterile room. They looked so pure, so innocent under the fluorescent lights, but I knew they were poisoned by the intent of the man who brought them. For Sophia, they were a fragile symbol of hope, a question mark she desperately wanted to turn into a period. For Ryan, they were merely the opening move in Vanessa's cruel chess match, a strategy aimed at leaving Sophia with absolutely nothing. Later, I could picture them in some sterile apartment, celebrating their performance. Ryan, buzzing with nervous energy, pacing back and forth, while Vanessa, cool and reptilian, sipped her wine. She's cracking, he'd say, a triumphant tremor in his voice. I saw it. She wants to believe me. And Vanessa would give that thin, predatory smile. Of course she does, darling. That's the beauty of it. Her heart is her fatal flaw. All we need is her signature on the right documents. Vanessa would continue, her voice like silk over steel. Once that ink is dry, she's finished. I could imagine Ryan's flicker of doubt. But her brothers, they're all over her. They'll never let it happen. Vanessa would cut him off, her patience wearing thin. That's why we'll be smarter. We'll disguise it. We'll make it look like a standard reconciliation agreement. A gesture of goodwill, but buried in the legal text will be clauses that hand over her assets, her shares, even her parental rights. I have a lawyer who specializes in this kind of delicate work. I'm sure Ryan would have hesitated, but what if she refuses? Vanessa would then lean in. her mask of civility dropping to reveal the monster beneath. Then you remind her what's at stake. You remind her that true forgiveness requires compromise. You make her understand that signing those papers is the only path to a peaceful life for her and that child. You use her love for that baby as a weapon against her. You make her believe it's the only way. I could see the dark satisfaction spreading across Ryan's face at the thought. To trick her so completely, to hold that ultimate power over her until it was too late, it was a temptation he couldn't resist. Exactly, Vanessa would purr, sealing the deal with a touch. She signs her future away, and we get everything. Her brothers can be as rich and powerful as they want, but they can't fight a war when their own sister has already surrendered. The next day, he came back. No flowers this time, just a crisp manila envelope held tightly in his hand, a weapon disguised as office supplies. He arrived when he knew her brothers would be in a meeting with the hospital administrator, a detail I'm sure he'd carefully arranged. He put on the same mask of sorrow, his voice a carefully modulated symphony of regret. "Sophia," he began, his tone soft and earnest, "I met with a lawyer this morning. He's hopeful for us. He really is. He drew up some preliminary paperwork just to, formalize our commitment to starting over." I watched from the doorway as suspicion clouded her exhausted face. "Paperwork?" she asked, her voice wary. Ryan pulled a chair close, his movements slow and non-threatening. "It's simple, really. Just a reconciliation agreement. A promise from both of us to move forward without anger. A clean slate." He set the envelope on her bedside table, not pushing it, just letting it sit there. "Look at it whenever you feel up to it. If you sign it, it's a signal to me, to everyone, that we're really going to try to make this work." I knew her brothers were only down the hall, talking to the chief of medicine. They'd be back any minute. But any minute could be too late. Sophia just stared at that envelope, her expression a heartbreaking mix of desperate hope and gut-wrenching fear. Was this his first step toward redemption, or was it the first step off a cliff? Ryan saw her hesitation and leaned in, his voice a hypnotic whisper. "Do this for us, Sophie. For our new family. Do it for our baby." My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw her hand, trembling uncontrollably, reach for that envelope. She couldn't know that the pen he would offer her was a weapon, and the ink inside it held the power to sign away her entire life. That envelope was a venomous snake coiled on her nightstand. Every time her gaze fell on it, I saw her flinch. Ryan's words had been a masterclass in manipulation, and they were still echoing in the quiet room. "Do it for the baby. A fresh start." I'd overheard her brothers warning her a dozen times. Ethan's words were sharp and direct. "He is a con artist, Sophia. He will play on your emotions. Do not let him." Lucas's were more blunt, a furious growl. "I'll kill him myself if he so much as looks at you again." And Matthew, the calm strategist, had been just as clear. Under no circumstances do you sign anything from him, not even a birthday card. But I know how it is when you're alone in the dark, with nothing but your own broken heart for company. A desperate part of her wanted to believe in fairy tales. She wanted more than anything to give her child a whole family, a father who loved them, a life that wasn't defined by this ugliness. Her heart was telling her to take a risk her mind knew was pure poison. "Maybe he's changed," she probably told herself over and over. "Maybe this time will be different." That night, I saw her light on late. I knew she wasn't sleeping. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was likely a soundtrack to her torture. I saw her silhouette as she held the envelope, turning it over and over. She was probably thinking about what would happen if she said no. The lonely years ahead, the whispers from strangers, the custody battle from hell, where he would paint her as vindictive and unstable. Could she endure that? I saw her shoulders shaking and knew she was crying, her tears dampening the thin hospital pillow. She was probably whispering to the life growing inside her, a confession of fear. "I don't know what to do," I imagined her saying. "Mommy is so lost. If I sign this, maybe he'll finally leave us in peace." "But what if I don't?" she'd whisper. "And he convinces a judge to take you away from me." That was the fear that could break anyone. The thought of losing her child was a more profound terror than any physical blow he had ever landed. And I saw it happening right before my eyes, her resolve crumbling, her spirit getting ready to surrender, just to make the war stop. As the first pale light of morning filtered into the room, I saw her tear the envelope open. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the thick sheaf of papers. They were dense with a language designed to confuse and intimidate, and her exhausted mind was no match for it. Words like custody, assets, and transfer of rights would have leaped out, but in her desperate state she likely twisted them into promises of peace and reconciliation. And then I saw her reach for the pen he had so thoughtfully left on her nightstand. I couldn't stand by anymore, not this time. With my heart pounding in my throat, I grabbed a pitcher of ice water, walked into her room, and with a clumsy, exaggerated stumble, I sent water cascading all over the documents. "Oh heavens, I am so sorry," I cried out, rushing forward with towels. "How incredibly clumsy of me." As I blotted the ruined, ink-smeared pages, I leaned in close and whispered, "Honey, you wait. You wait for your brothers. Don't you sign a single thing." I remember the first time I saw a bruise on her arm, a deep purple stain she tried to hide under the sleeve of her scrubs. She'd laughed it off, said she'd walked into a door frame, and I, like a coward, let it go. That memory clawed at me, now as I stood in the hallway, pretending to check a chart. Through the crack in her hospital room door, I saw what looked like a peace offering from a distance, but the tension in the air felt like a tightening noose. Her pen was in her hand, trembling over the papers on the bedside tray. Her whole body shook, a leaf in a hurricane, and the pen almost fell from her fingers. As the nib hovered over the signature line, my own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of guilt. I should go in, I should say something. But before I could move, the door flew open with such force it slammed against the wall. Ethan Bennett, all righteous fury, stormed in, his two brothers right behind him. His gaze, sharp as broken glass, found those papers instantly. He stopped dead. His voice was a crack of thunder that shook the entire floor. "Sophia, put that pen down." She flinched as if struck. Tears I hadn't seen before spilled down her pale cheeks in silver tracks. Her voice was a broken whisper, a sound that will haunt me forever. "But Ethan," she pleaded, "what if this is the only way?" In a blur of motion, her brothers had the documents out of her hands. What they found in that sheaf of papers turned the air in the room to ice. I watched from the doorway, my feet rooted to the floor, a silent, guilty spectator to a life nearly destroyed. Ethan's hands, usually so steady in surgery, trembled with a rage so profound it was terrifying. He flipped through the thick stack, his face growing darker, more chiseled with fury, with every line his eyes devoured. Ryan was gone, but his poison was right there, written in cold, legal ink. Matthew, the thinker, moved closer, pushing his glasses up his nose, his analytical mind already dissecting the treachery. All the while, Lucas remained by Sophia's side, a protective anchor, his hand gripping hers, as if to pull her back from the cliff's edge she'd almost stepped off. His face was ghostly white, with the terrifying realization of how close she'd come. "These aren't for reconciliation." Ethan's voice was a low growl. vibrating with an anger that promised retribution. This is a meticulously crafted trap. He practically shoved the stack at Matthew, unable to look at it any longer. Matthew's fingers flew through the pages, his experience with contracts and finance allowing him to see the venom hidden in the dense legal language. To him, the deceit was as obvious and ugly as a gaping wound. He jabbed a page with his finger, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through Sophia's tears. "Right here," he announced, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "This clause, it transfers full and sole custody of your child to Ryan if you ever separate. No questions, no court." He flipped another page. "And this one strips you of all property rights, not just what you built together, Sophia. It takes away assets you had before you even met him." Sophia's eyes stretched wide in disbelief, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The sound was painful to hear. "What?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, he said it was for a fresh start, a clean slate." Matthew shook his head, his expression a mixture of pity and grim reality. "No, Sophia, this wasn't a fresh start," he said, his words precise and devastating. "If you had put your name on this, you would have been left with absolutely nothing. Not your money, not this hospital, not your home. He would have taken your baby from you," Matthew finished, the words hanging in the sterile air like a death sentence. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob breaking free as her body was racked with violent tremors. That simple pen, the instrument of her near-total destruction, rolled off the tray and clattered onto the linoleum floor, the sound echoing the shattering of her world. Fresh tears streamed down her cheeks, born not of sorrow, but of pure terror. "I almost gave him everything," she cried, her voice muffled by her hand. "I almost signed away my own child. That was it for Lucas." He exploded, a raw sound of rage tearing from his throat as he slammed his fist into the wall. The impact was so loud that nurses down the hall jumped and turned to stare. "I'm going to find him," he roared, his body vibrating with the need for violence. "I will drag him back to this room and make him eat every single one of these pages." Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing his younger brother's arm with unyielding strength. "No," he commanded. "We don't beat him with our fists, Lucas. We are going to dismantle him with the truth." His eyes were burning coals as he turned to Matthew. "Tell me this is enough. Tell me we can use this against him." Matthew gave a slow, deliberate nod. A cold, dangerous light sparked in his eyes, the look of a predator who has its prey cornered. "Oh, absolutely," he confirmed. He confirmed, his voice chillingly calm. "This is far beyond simple deception. This is textbook fraud. Any judge in the country will see this for the malicious scheme it is." He paused, a thought occurring to him. "And if we're lucky, if Vanessa was sloppy enough to leave her fingerprints anywhere on these documents, we can tie her directly to this conspiracy too." Sophia's sobs were a raw, wounded sound in the quiet room, her hands clutching her belly as if to shield her unborn child from the evil she had just escaped. "Why?" she wept. "How could he do this to me? The man I loved, the man I trusted with my heart. How could he want to steal my baby from me?" Ethan knelt by her bedside, his large, surgeon's hand resting gently on her shoulder, a stark contrast to the fury he'd shown moments before. His voice softened, full of a sad, hard-won wisdom. "Because he isn't the man you loved anymore, Sophie. That man is long gone. What's left behind is a weak, greedy shell, poisoned by that woman's influence. But you listen to me very carefully. He will never, ever take your baby." Not as long as we are standing here, Ethan." Ethan vowed, and for the first time, I saw the terror in Sophia's eyes recede, replaced by a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. The weight of her brother's conviction was a shield, and for the first time, she truly seemed to believe she could be saved. But as the Bennets began to forge their strategy in that sterile hospital room, a scene was playing out across town that made my stomach turn. Ryan and Vanessa were toasting their success in some dark, sleazy bar, utterly convinced their cruel trick was on the verge of working. I could just picture it. Vanessa leaning back in her seat, a smug, venomous smile on her face. "She'll break any minute now," she'd say. "She's always been too soft to hold out for long." Ryan would laugh, raising his glass in a toast. "And when she signs," he'd reply, "everything she has becomes ours." They were celebrating a victory they would never achieve, blissfully unaware that the very papers they had forged with such malice were about to become the hammer that would bring their entire world crashing down around them. That fraudulent contract was the final, unforgivable sin. For so many weeks, I had watched Sophia walk the halls like a ghost. She lived inside a cage of fear, terrified of Ryan's temper, drowning in the shame of his public betrayal, and slowly being crushed by the humiliation of it all. I'd see her in the break room, her eyes red-rimmed from crying in private, and I'd look away, convinced she was too fragile to fight, and I was too scared to help. But as I lingered in the hall, hearing Matthew meticulously break down how Ryan had plotted to steal her entire future with a single stroke of a pen, I witnessed a profound change. Something inside her was reforging itself in the fires of betrayal. Later, lying in that hospital bed, Sophia stared at her own bruised face in the small mirror by the window. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't seeing a victim staring back. She was seeing a survivor. She was seeing a mother. Her hand went to her swollen belly, a gesture of infinite love and protection. I heard her whisper to her unborn child, a vow that was stronger than steel. "I will never let anyone take you away from me." "Not him," she whispered again with more force. "Not her, never again." Her brothers, ever watchful, sensed the shift in her almost instantly. It was Ethan who voiced it first, his tone calm but filled with a deep, rumbling pride. "Your strength is returning," he observed, a small smile touching his lips. "That's good, because we're going to need every bit of it for what we have to do next." Sophia lifted her chin, and the look in her eyes was no longer one of fear, but of fiery determination. "I want to fight," she declared, her voice clear and steady. "I am done hiding from him." A fierce, relieved grin split Lucas's face. "That's the sister I know," he said, his relief palpable. Matthew then slid a thick folder onto her lap. I saw the contents from the doorway. Neatly organized documents, clinical medical reports, detailing her injuries, stark photographs of her bruises, and a meticulously compiled timeline of Ryan's escalating abuse. "This is our foundation," Matthew explained gently. "If you're ready to testify, we can build an unbreakable case. But you need to know, it means facing this all in public." I remember the first time I saw the lie in her eyes. It was a faint shadow, a flicker of fear she tried to hide behind a professional smile. "They'll try to shame you," I thought, watching her from across the nurse's station months ago. I saw the faint bruise on her wrist, the one she quickly covered with her sleeve. "They'll say you're exaggerating." I heard the whispers, saw the way Ryan would put a hand on her back that looked like a caress, but was really a warning. "They'll twist your words." And I did nothing. My own hands shake now, remembering it all as I look at the legal folder Lucas brought for her. My guilt is a cold, heavy stone in my gut. But when Sophia looks at those papers, Her resolve is steel. "Let them try," she whispers, and the sound is louder than a shout. "They can't take my truth from me." Her brothers share a glance, one of pure admiration, and I feel a fresh wave of shame. I watched her become this fragile woman, whispering apologies into her pillow at night because I helped forge the very documents meant to break her. And now I'm watching her rise, piece by painful piece, into the warrior she was born to be. The next morning, when she demands real clothes, not that flimsy hospital gown, it feels like the first real battle cry. With her brother's gentle assistance, she puts on a simple blouse and pants, an armor of her own choosing. The bruises stood out like dark ink against her pale skin, a map of her suffering. I flinched just looking at them, my own cowardice, a phantom ache in my bones. But she didn't hide them. She wore them. "These are not marks of shame," she told Ethan when he's offered her a scarf. Her voice so firm it silenced the entire room, including the frantic beating of my own heart. "These are proof of what he did." My complicity felt like a brand on my soul. I had seen the evidence of his cruelty for months and had chosen my own safety over her life. Now, watching her brothers stand by her, their faces etched with a fierce, protective love, I felt my resolve harden. Their dignity was a mirror to my disgrace, and I couldn't stand the reflection anymore. That afternoon, as the four of them gathered in the sterile hospital conference room, I hovered outside, pretending to check charts. I watched them plan, their unity a fortress. Ethan's voice was sharp and clear as he spoke to lawyers on the phone. Matthew was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, hiring private investigators to unravel the dirty financial secrets I knew Ryan and Vanessa kept, and Lucas, her rock, was methodically calling her colleagues, gathering the very statements I had been too terrified to give. I was the missing piece, the key, and I was hiding in the shadows. Yet the most powerful move of all came directly from Sophia. She sat with a legal pad and wrote out her official statement, line by painstaking line. She poured all the truth she had been forced to swallow for so long onto the page. Her hand shook with the memory of it all, but her words were resolute. When she finally finished, she looked up at her brothers, her eyes clear. "This isn't just for me anymore," she said. "This is for every other woman out there who was made to believe she had to suffer in silence." As she signed her name at the bottom of that document, Sophia had no idea she was lighting the match. She was igniting the first spark of a wildfire that would ultimately consume Ryan and Vanessa, leaving nothing but their own ashes behind. The day Sophia signed her sworn statement, the Bennetts transitioned from quiet, strategic planning to all-out war. For weeks, Ryan and Vanessa had been reveling in their own cleverness, so sure they had backed Sophia into a corner with no hope of escape. What they had failed to calculate, what they could never have understood, was the power of three devoted brothers, armed with immense resources, untouchable influence, and a loyalty so fierce it could move mountains. And they had pushed a Bennett too far. Ethan took charge of the public narrative, using his extensive connections in the New York media landscape. He reached out to journalists he knew and trusted implicitly. "I want the truth broadcast everywhere," he commanded into his phone, his voice echoing with authority. "No gossip, no rumors, just the cold, hard facts. We publicize the domestic abuse, we expose the financial manipulation, and we bury them with the evidence of their own fraud." While Ethan managed the press, Matthew worked in the shadows, deploying a team of forensic accountants and private investigators to crawl through every corner of Ryan's financial history. In a matter of days, the incriminating evidence began to flood in. A mountain of unpaid debts, clumsily falsified tax returns, and a clear trail of transactions linking Ryan's failing auto shop directly to Vanessa's bar. "They've been laundering money together for months," Matthew reported, during a late-night meeting in Sophia's room, pointing to a complex chart on his tablet. It's amateurish, sloppy work, but it's more than enough to prove collusion in a court of law. Once this information becomes public, any credibility they have will completely evaporate. And Lucas, he took on the human element of their war. He met with Sophia's coworkers, our neighbors, even the emergency medical technicians who had been first on the scene, who had carried her out of that house while she was barely conscious. One by one, he collected their stories, their sworn statements of what they had seen and heard. The ugly bruises, the terrified screaming matches, the night it all came to a head. Lucas's burning anger seemed to cool whenever he looked at his sister. Every person who speaks up makes your voice louder, Sophie. He told her gently, his hand on her shoulder. You are not standing alone in this anymore. But Sophia herself was the true epicenter of the counteroffensive. At first, the thought of telling her story publicly filled her with a familiar, paralyzing dread. She had spent an eternity hiding her pain from the world. But when Ethan secured a discreet, primetime interview with a nationally respected journalist, Sophia found her courage and agreed. Sitting in front of the camera, she spoke with a quiet, unshakable dignity. Her voice was a little shaky at the start, but it soon found its strength, its rhythm. She talked about the love she had so freely given Ryan, the endless sacrifices she had made for their life together, and then, the night, he shattered it all, choosing violence over the trust she had placed in him. He tried to take everything I have, she said, her hand resting protectively over her unborn child. But he forgot one crucial thing, she continued, looking directly into the camera, into the eyes of millions. I still have my truth, and I refuse to be silent 1 second longer. When that interview aired, it didn't just spread, it exploded. It was a cultural wildfire that swept across the state of California and then the nation. People watched, their hearts breaking, their blood boiling. Social media ignited with a singular, furious voice. The hashtag Justice for Sophia began trending worldwide. Flowers, letters, and messages of support poured into the hospital, a tidal wave of solidarity that gave her a strength she never knew she could possess. Ryan and Vanessa, meanwhile, awoke the next morning to find themselves at the center of a maelstrom. Customers canceled appointments at Ryan's auto shop en masse. Vanessa's bar was facing city-wide boycotts. A horde of journalists had set up camp on their front lawns, their cameras and microphones like weapons demanding answers. Ryan stood on his porch, screaming at them, his face purple with rage. She's lying! She's... And that's when I finally acted. I packaged the security footage from the hospital corridor from the night she was admitted. Footage that showed Ryan, alone, whispering a vicious threat into his phone. I sent it anonymously to Matthew Bennett's law firm, a small act after a lifetime of silence. It was my truth, too. It all started the day I saw the news report. I was sitting on my worn-out couch, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, when Sophia Bennett's face filled the screen. Her testimony was a gut punch, and every word she spoke about that monster, Ryan, felt like it was tearing a piece out of me, because I knew I'd seen it. I remember the first time Ryan came into the bar after a fight. He had this ugly, triumphant smirk on his face, and Vanessa just poured him a drink, laughing about something under her breath. I saw the darkness in them then, a shared cruelty that made my stomach turn, but I just kept my head down and wiped the counter. A coward. Now hearing Sophia's quiet, brave voice, my silence felt like a crime. I watched them on TV, Vanessa with her crocodile tears in some interview, and I knew it was all a performance. I had seen the real her, the one who schemed in the back office, and a cold dread washed over me as I realized this was far from over. Cornered animals. The reporter said someone had warned, and I knew two of the most dangerous ones personally. The fallout was immediate, and I saw it from behind the bar every single night. The place I worked, Vanessa's pride and joy, turned into a ghost town. The regulars who used to laugh with her now just glared as they walked by outside. The phone would ring, but it was never a customer. It was just people screaming insults before hanging up. Ryan would come in, his face a thundercloud of fury, his auto shop failing just as badly. He wasn't sad or regretful. He was furious that he'd been caught, that his victim had dared to speak. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, they seemed to feed on it, their humiliation twisting into a venomous rage that they aimed at the one person who deserved none of it, Sophia. They were losing everything, and it made them reckless, unpredictable. I could feel the hatred thickening the air in that empty bar, a poison they were brewing just for her. I'll never forget this night they cemented their plan. I was in the back, restocking, pretending not to listen, as their whispers turned to venomous hisses under the failing neon sign outside. "She's ruining me," Ryan growled, his voice low and guttural, and the sound of his fist hitting the cheap wooden table made me jump. "Everything I built, my name, it's all garbage because of her and those brothers." I held my breath, hidden by the shadows and shelves of liquor. That's when I heard Vanessa's voice, colder and sharper than a shard of glass. "Then we ruin her first, before she can get any stronger," she said. "We have to break her spirit, Ryan. We have to make everyone see her as a fraud, a liar, so that nobody ever believes a word she says again." Ryan sounded desperate, defeated. "But how?" he asked. That's when I heard the soft slide of a folder across the table, a sound that would haunt my sleep for weeks. I peeked through the crack in the door, my heart pounding against my ribs. I saw what was in that folder, and it made me sick. There were pictures of Sophia, but her face was pasted onto another woman's body, embracing a stranger. There were printouts of text messages, cruel and flirtatious words I knew she would never write. Vanessa had even created fake hotel receipts, weaving a disgusting story of infidelity. "We leak these," Vanessa explained, her tone dripping with malicious satisfaction. "We create the narrative that she was cheating, living a secret life. All that public sympathy she has will turn to disgust overnight. They'll call her a tramp, a liar." Ryan's answering smile was slow and cruel, a predator's grin. "And her precious brothers can't protect her from that kind of shame," he said. They were creating a lie so toxic it could poison everything, and I was the only one who saw it happen. A few days later, the storm broke. I was at home when I saw the headlines online, the same filthy lies I had seen in that folder, now plastered everywhere for the world to consume. My hands trembled as I watched a news clip of Sophia in the hospital, a nurse showing her the articles on a phone. The raw agony on her face. Her choked cry of, "No, this isn't true," shattered what was left of my composure. I had stayed silent. I had let this happen. Ethan Bennett's furious roar to not look at this trash was righteous, but I knew the poison was already seeping in. The comment sections were a cesspool of victim blaming. "Maybe he had a reason," one person wrote. "She seems like a liar," said another. Each comment felt like my own personal judgment, a reflection of my cowardice. I was complicit in her pain, a silent partner to their evil. I imagined the scene in that hospital room, the fury of her brothers. I could almost hear Lucas's rage, his promises to hunt down the source of the lies. I pictured Matthew, the calm one, dissecting their strategy, knowing they needed more than just anger to win. And I saw Sophia, curled up, her hopes starting to fracture under the weight of this new, calculated cruelty. They were trying to erase her truth, to bury her voice under a mountain of their own fabrications. And as I sat there, paralyzed by fear and regret, a tiny, unfamiliar spark ignited inside me. They were counting on everyone being too scared to challenge them. They were counting on people like me to stay quiet forever. But what if I didn't? What if I took the one thing I had, the truth, and used it as a shield for her? The thought was terrifying, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like hope. The guilt was a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, to sleep, to live. I couldn't watch them destroy that woman, not after I'd seen her courage. So I made a decision. It was small and terrifying, but it was mine. I couldn't undo the nights I spent silently polishing glasses while they plotted, but I could stop the lies from going any further. The smear campaign was their masterstroke, designed to isolate her, to make her doubt herself. But seeing her face on the television, even when the world was turning on her again, I saw a fighter. That gave me the push I needed. That evening, I put on my cleanest jacket, my hands shaking so badly I could barely button it, and took a bus to the hospital. Every step toward that private lounge felt like walking to my own execution, but for the first time, I'm dying. I wasn't running from the truth. I was walking toward it. When I knocked on the door, my knuckles barely making a sound, I was ready to confess everything. When the door swung open, a tall, imposing man who had to be Ethan Bennett filled the frame. His whole body coiled like he was ready for a fight. His eyes were sharp, suspicious, and for a second my courage deserted me completely. But then I saw her over his shoulder. Sophia. She looked so fragile, sitting on the couch, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been extinguished. I cleared my throat, my voice barely a whisper. "Are you Sophia Bennett?" I asked, clutching my purse like a lifeline. She gave a small, hesitant nod. When I stepped inside that room, the protective energy from her brothers was almost overwhelming. "My name is Marisol Vega," I said, forcing myself to meet their gazes. "I used to work for Vanessa Lopez. I was her assistant at the bar for 3 years. My voice was trembling, but I had to get the words out. And I saw what they did. I can prove everything." The silence in the room was absolute, so heavy I could feel it pressing down on me. It was Ethan who spoke first, his voice low and dangerous. "What exactly can you prove?" My hands shook as I opened my purse and pulled out the folder, my confession and my proof. Inside were the original documents Vanessa had asked me to work on. Copies of the real text messages I'd seen her type on a burner phone, and my own handwritten notes detailing every conversation I'd overheard. Vanessa had me forge those things, I confessed, my voice cracking. The fake messages, the hotel bills. She made me help. I quit the day she showed me the final versions. I couldn't be a part of destroying someone like that. Sophia's gasp was a small, wounded sound. You saw her?" I looked directly at her, needing her to see the truth in my eyes. "I saw it all," I said, tears finally spilling over. She was proud of it. She laughed and said that once everyone thought you were a liar, Ryan could take the baby, and your brothers wouldn't be able to do a thing to stop him. I watched as the brothers reacted. Lucas shot up from his chair, a caged tiger of pure rage, pacing the floor and muttering about how he was going to tear them apart. But Matthew, the quiet one, was the one who scared me more. He took the folder from my trembling hands and examined every single page with a terrifying, calm intensity. His eyes scanned my notes, the forged documents, everything. "This is it," he said, his voice flat, but carrying more weight than his brother's shouting. "Her testimony combined with these documents, will completely incinerate any credibility Vanessa or Ryan have left. He looked up from the papers, and his calm expression had shifted into something incredibly fierce and focused. This is the weapon we needed. For the first time, I felt a sliver of relief. I had brought my evidence to the right people. They weren't just angry, they were strategic. Ethan then turned his intense gaze back to me. His voice was even, but it held a clear warning. If you do this, if you testify, she will come for you. Vanessa is not the kind of person who lets things go. Are you ready for that? I thought of the past 3 years, of all the times I had looked away, of all the casual cruelty I had ignored because I needed a paycheck. I thought of Sophia's face on the screen. Straightening my back, I met his eyes. She's already taken enough from people. She's not taking anything else from me or from her, I said, nodding toward Sophia. I'll go to court. I'll talk to reporters. I'll stand on a rooftop and shout it if I have to. She doesn't get to silence me anymore. That's when Sophia stood up and walked over, taking both of my hands in hers. Her hands were cold, but her grip was strong. Tears of pure, unadulterated gratitude streamed down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me my voice back." In that moment, holding her hands, I finally felt like I was becoming the person I was supposed to be. But our newfound hope was fragile. That night, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. Just 2 words. "You're dead." I knew it was from Vanessa. She must have found out I was gone, that I had betrayed her. The Bennetts immediately moved me to a safe location, but the threat hung in the air. We all knew a quiet legal victory wouldn't be enough. To truly free Sophia, we had to expose them in a way they could never recover from. A public spectacle they couldn't spin. And Ethan found the perfect stage. The annual Beverly Hills Business Gala. It was a glittering, high-profile event, crawling with media and influential people. It was Vanessa and Ryan's world, a place where they wore masks of respectability. And it was there that we were going to rip those masks off in front of everyone. The plan was audacious, and I was terrified. But I was also a part of it. I was no longer a witness. I was a warrior in their army. The night of the gala felt surreal. I arrived through a service entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs, while Sophia and her brothers made their grand entrance through the front. From a hidden alcove, I watched her walk in. She wore a simple navy dress, not hiding the faint bruises on her skin, but wearing them like a warrior's marks. She looked regal, strong, with one hand resting protectively on her belly. A wave of whispers followed her through the opulent ballroom. Everyone knew the story, or at least the lies, and then I saw them. Ryan, looking smug in a tailored suit, and Vanessa, dripping in diamonds, clinging to his arm. They were the king and queen of this glittering world built on deceit. Their smiles were plastered on, but I saw the moment their eyes landed on Sophia. I saw the confidence drain from their faces, replaced by a flicker of pure panic. This was our battlefield, and the battle was about to begin. My hands were clammy as I waited backstage. I could hear the murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, and then a commanding voice that cut through it all. It was Ethan. He had taken the stage during a lull. "Tonight is not about business," his voice boomed, and a hush fell over the entire ballroom. "Tonight is about truth." My cue was coming. I watched from the wings as Sophia stepped into the spotlight. Her voice shook at first, but it grew stronger with every word she spoke, painting a vivid, heartbreaking picture of the abuse she had endured. "For months I was silent," she said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the city's elite. "And when I finally spoke, the man who did this and his mistress tried to bury me in lies." The gasps were audible. I could see Vanessa's face contort into a mask of fury. "But I am not a liar," Sophia declared, her voice ringing with power, "and tonight, I have a witness who will prove it." That was my signal. Matthew gave me a reassuring nod, and I walked out from behind the curtain and into the blinding lights of the stage. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as I, a complete unknown, approached the microphone. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on me, judging, questioning. For a terrifying second, my throat closed up. Then, I found Sophia's gaze in the crowd. She gave me a small, brave smile, and it was all the strength I needed. I took a deep, shuddering breath and leaned toward the microphone. My own voice, once silent, now ready to echo through that hall of lies. "My name is Marisol Vega," I said, my voice shaking but clear for everyone to hear. "I worked for Vanessa Lopez, and she asked me to help her forge the documents you all read about online. The false evidence that was designed to ruin Sophia's reputation. Vanessa ordered me to do it." My voice trembled, but for the first time in months, it felt like my own. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird, desperate for freedom. I kept silent out of fear, but I can't anymore. I won't. My hands, though shaking, felt steady as I held up the tablet, projecting its contents onto the massive screen behind the stage, where they were supposed to be honored. The room fell silent, then erupted. "Here are the originals. Here is the email chain. This is the truth." The chaos was instantaneous, a tidal wave of sound and fury. Reporters surged forward, their questions a barrage of accusations aimed at the couple of the hour. The elegant guests, who moments before were sipping champagne, now turned on Ryan and Vanessa with open disgust. I saw Ryan's face, a mask of arrogant confidence, completely drain of color, leaving behind a pasty, terrified shell. Vanessa's carefully constructed composure finally shattered, and she spun towards me, her voice a venomous hiss that cut through the noise. "You traitor!" But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at Sophia, who stood tall, tears of vindication glittering in her eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was unwavering. "You tried to break me, but tonight I take back everything you tried to steal." As security guards began moving purposefully toward Ryan and Vanessa, a tremor of finality ran through me. My small act of courage had lit the fuse, and now the entire lie was about to detonate, was about to explode. A final, damning revelation that would guarantee their ruin forever. The ballroom had devolved into pure bedlam. The flashes from the reporters' cameras were like strobe lights in a nightmare, catching the shocked and horrified expressions on every face. The whispers had grown from a murmur to a roar, a storm of judgment breaking over Ryan and Vanessa's heads. On stage, my testimony, backed by the undeniable proof projected for all to see, had stripped away every layer of their deception. Their carefully crafted image was in ashes. Security was closing in, and Vanessa's mask of a society queen didn't just crack, it disintegrated. With a raw scream of fury, she lunged, not at Sophia, but at me. "You think you can ruin me? You're nothing, Shisha. Buzztail with the buspido pine," she shrieked, her voice shrill with desperation. But before she could reach me, 2 guards seized her arms, pulling her back as she kicked and thrashed. Her gown, a shimmering beacon of wealth and power just minutes before, now looked like the cheap costume of a cornered animal, a desperate woman whose true, ugly nature was exposed for the world to see, a woman who had been completely unmasked. Ryan, in stark contrast, was frozen in place, a statue of crumbling bravado. The weight of hundreds of condemning eyes seemed to physically crush him. He started to stammer, his voice thin and pathetic. It's all fake. She's lying. Sophia's lying." But the words were hollow, dissolving into the charged, atmosphere of the room. Nobody believed him. The forged documents I had created, now displayed next to the originals I had saved, the witness testimony Lucas had gathered, the damning financial evidence Matthew had unearthed. It was an avalanche of truth. His frantic denials only made him appear smaller, weaker, more guilty. That's when Ethan stepped to the microphone, his voice resonating with righteous anger, booming through the ballroom. This is the man who beat his pregnant wife, who tried to steal her child, and who thought he could silence her with lies and threats. Not tonight. Not ever again. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd burst into thunderous applause, the sound mixing with cheers and shouts of righteous indignation, a unified voice of support for Sophia and condemnation for her abusers. Waves of outrage directed at Ryan and Vanessa. Standing near me, Lucas clenched his fists, his knuckles white, and leaned toward his sister, his voice thick with relief, and, "They're finished." As if on cue, police officers, summoned in advance by the Bennetts, began to file into the ballroom, their presence silencing the crowd. Vanessa let out a piercing shriek as the cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the microphone, locking around her wrists. Ryan struggled, his voice cracking with disbelief and entitlement. "You can't do this to me. I'm her husband." But the officers paid him no mind, professionally reciting his rights as they firmly escorted him away in front of every camera, every pair of eyes. I watched Sophia's face as tears streamed down her cheeks. These weren't the tears of pain I had seen her hide for so long. They were tears of pure, unadulterated release. I felt it too, a vicarious unburdening. For the first time, she could breathe, and I felt the suffocating weight of my own silence finally lift from my chest. She was no longer the broken woman cowering on a hospital floor. She was standing tall, surrounded by justice I had helped deliver, surrounded by the undeniable power of truth and justice. The reporters swarmed her, their cameras flashing even brighter now, desperate to capture the face of a survivor. One of them managed to call out over the noise, "Sophia, do you have a message for other women watching tonight?" She accepted the microphone, and my breath caught in my throat. Her hand was perfectly steady, her voice carrying through the hall, ringing with a clarity and strength that seemed impossible just days ago. "Yes," she said, "never stay silent. Never let anyone convince you that you are weak. I thought I had to endure it, that I had to hide my pain to protect my child." Her eyes scanned the room, and for a moment, they met mine. But the truth is, speaking out is the only way to protect what we love. To every woman who is suffering in silence, your voice matters. You are not alone. The applause that followed was deafening. It felt like it could shake the very foundations of the building. It came from everyone. Strangers, allies, even the stone-faced business leaders who moments ago were shaking Ryan's hand. They were all on their feet, not just for her, but for the courage it took to speak. They all stood, clapping and cheering, for her incredible courage. Much later that night, after the chaos of the gala had finally subsided, and Ryan and Vanessa were nothing more than a headline in the making, being driven away in separate police cars, I saw Sophia standing with her brothers. They were just outside, beneath the vast, quiet canopy of the California stars. I watched from a distance as Ethan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Sophie," he said, his voice gentle. "You're free." A real, genuine smile finally reached Sophia's eyes, even through her tears. Her hand rested protectively on her belly. "Not just free," she whispered, a promise to herself and her unborn child. "Stronger, for me and for my baby." As the Bennett siblings pulled into a tight embrace, a family reforged in fire. The world finally knew the truth. Sophia Bennett was never a victim. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a mother who had just taken her entire life back. And I, Ed, the silent witness, had finally found my voice to help her do it. At this very moment, my friend, it means that some part of this journey resonated deep within your heart, in a way that mere words can't fully capture. Sophia's story was never just about betrayal or some dramatic quest for revenge. It was a testament to survival, to reclaiming one's dignity, and to discovering the immense courage required to rise again when everything around you has been shattered. Life has a funny and often cruel way of throwing violent storms into our paths. Sometimes the most devastating storms are unleashed by the very people we once trusted with our whole hearts. But I learned a profound truth through all of this. Pain does not have to define us. What truly defines us is how we make the choice, day after day, to get back on our feet. As the great Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Sophia discovered that unimaginable strength, as did I, in the moment she refused to be silenced. That single moment, she decided her truth was more powerful than her fear. Her scars were no longer something to hide. They became her testimony. Her tears were no longer a sign of weakness. They became the source of her courage. And with the unwavering support of her incredible family, she proved to the entire world that no lie, no act of cruelty, no profound betrayal can ever truly extinguish the truth. That is a lesson that we can all take with us into the battles of our own lives. Perhaps you have been deeply hurt. Perhaps you have felt utterly abandoned and alone. Please remember, you are not weak. You are not alone. And sometimes, taking that terrifying first step of speaking your truth is the beginning of your journey toward freedom. I really want you to sit with that idea for a moment, because if you have stayed with me, listening to my part in this story until the very end, perhaps it is because some part of you needed to be reminded that your voice is powerful, that your dignity is non-negotiable, and that healing is always possible, even in the aftermath of the darkest nights, after the most terrifying and desolate nights. Now, before our paths diverge, I have just one small request to make of you. If Sophia's story of resilience moved you, if my own small act of courage gave you even a tiny spark of strength, then please take a moment to hit the like button, share this video with someone in your life who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, we can create a community together, one that continues to tell the stories that remind us all of the incredible courage that lies dormant within us. Because in the end, as the philosopher Epictetus taught us, it is not what happens to you, but how you choose to react to it that truly matters. And like Sophia, and in my own small way, like me, may we all find the strength to learn how to react with unshakable courage. Content disclaimer. The story, characters, and events presented in this video are the result of original research, creative development, and careful manual editorial work by our production team. The narrative is designed to carry meaningful lessons and emotional truths that resonate with real human experiences. All names are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, is entirely coincidental. Our content is created with the sole purpose of inspiring, educating, and uplifting our audience, never to harm or misrepresent.